Water restrictions in the West are making news. Is Arizona far behind?
Right now, we've been taking excess CAP water and storing it underground. It'll be difficult to do that, so we'll see some changes coming up, but Arizona has planned very well.
Not all of the state's water problems are based on supply. Tiny quagga mussels are making it more difficult to move water across Arizona.
We're at a point where there is no way to control them. The best control is to not let them in.
Arizona water. Is there enough, and how do we deal with the ongoing drought? This is Arizona Week. Hello and welcome to Arizona Week. I'm Christopher Conover in for Lorraine Rivera. California's water problems and that state's mandated cuts for municipalities are at the top of the news across the nation. But Arizona has water problems of its own. Before we begin this week's look at water, let's go over some of the basics. Arizona's water comes from 5 main sources. The largest share comes from groundwater, like aquifers far beneath the surface. The Central Arizona Project brings the state about a quarter of its water supply, and water taken directly from the Colorado River accounts for a little less. Surface water other than the Colorado is also a factor, and reclaimed water often used to irrigate golf courses and parks accounts for the smallest share of Arizona water. Arizona is a junior partner on the Colorado. Our share supplies the equivalent of about 500,000 households. The water supply for the Metro Phoenix area comes from a number of surface water sources, including the Central Arizona Project. The CAP supplies most of the water for Metro Tucson. Agriculture is the biggest user and will be the first to take cuts if we have to give up some of our Colorado River water. Conservation is always part of the water discussion. Every Arizona resident uses, on average, more than 100 gallons a day. As we just saw, much of the water Phoenix and Tucson use comes from the Central Arizona Project. The top of the CAP system is Lake Pleasant in Peoria, just north of Phoenix. The lake does not have that familiar bathtub ring seen at Lake Mead indicating low water levels, but it does have another problem: quagga mussels.
Quagga mussels can be a huge problem, especially for water delivery systems, water treatment plants, and the ecosystem in general.
The tiny bivalves can attach to nearly any structure, and a single female can produce 1 million eggs a year. Those abilities don't cause problems with the water you and I drink, but they do make the water harder to get.
Really spells trouble for a water conveyance system like CAP, where we have multiple pumping plants, all kinds of moving parts where these quagga mussels can attach. They clog up the water flow, they foul up motors and pumps, they get into flow sensors, just about everywhere you can imagine.
How badly can they clog an intake? The CAP regularly removes mussels from water intakes at Lake Havasu.
We have a 6-inch gap between those grates so that water can flow through. Well, those quagga mussels start piling up on top of each other, and they close that gap down to 2, 3, 4 inches, and you're really affecting the amount of flow that you can get through.
Quagga mussels are filter feeders. As a result, they clean the water at Lake Havasu, a benefit for boaters and swimmers, but that now clear water has allowed massive plant growth. The change in water quality can also affect fish.
They eat the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, which are the basic food for small juvenile fish. So once they filter all those out of the water, there's nothing left for the fish. You have a pretty big impact on the fishery in a body of water.
What can water managers do to control the quaggas? The answer at Lake Pleasant and in the CAP is not simple. First, in a body of water the size of Lake Pleasant, nothing. The quaggas are here to stay. But in the CAP canals, there are some options.
Some of those things include using chemical controls inside pumping plants, biological controls like a bacteria. UV light is very good. They've been attaching to our cooling water intake grates, which are about 8 to 12 inch grates. at our pumping plants. We coat those grates with a silicone foul release paint, and basically the quagga mussels can't attach to it, they slip right off. Another thing we've tried recently is stocking red ear sunfish. Red ear sunfish are also known as shell crackers. They love to eat mussels, quagga mussels especially.
Those fish are not in Lake Pleasant. They're only in enclosed areas, so they don't spread because, like the quaggas, they're not native to the area. The CAP and Game and Fish are also trying to inform boaters about what they can do to keep the mussels from spreading to lakes like Roosevelt and Apache east of Phoenix.
We're trying to get boaters to be conscious of the fact that these mussels can attach anywhere on their boats. They can get in the live wells. They can get in anywhere that holds water on the boats. So by clean draining and drying your boat, we're hoping we can really reduce the spread of the mussels.
And then of course I gotta go by and inspect it.
The quagga mussels are now found not only in Lakes Havasu and Pleasant, but also in Meade and Powell and in the Colorado River itself. The U.S. Geological Survey operates the Arizona Water Science Center. Joining us now in the studio is Jim Leanhoutz with the USGS. Thanks so much for coming in.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Let's start off by educating our viewers a little bit on what the survey does when it comes to water and what you all are doing at the Science Center.
Absolutely. So the USGS is, we're the science agency for the Department of Interior. And our core mission, or a key piece of our mission, is to assess the status and trends of the nation's natural resources, including, of course, water resources. And we assess those resources in a number of ways. Perhaps one of the most familiar of those to people is our stream gauging network on the water side of things. So we operate a wide network of stream gauges across the nation that provide information about stream flows. But a somewhat lesser known piece of the water monitoring that we do is an assessment of water use on a national basis every 5 years. So starting in 1950, the USGS started collecting and compiling water use information on a state-by-state basis, and then using that to do national assessments. And we publish that every 5 years. So starting in 1950, there's a report published each 5 years.
So the latest data we have is from 2010, and I also just want to clear up to keep you out of trouble. USGS is not a policy-making agency. You supply the numbers to the policymakers, and that's their department, not your department. So we're not talking about policy here today, but let's talk about some of the withdrawals nationally and here in Arizona. What are we seeing nationally and in the state when it comes to over time and even the most recent numbers, withdrawals, use of water?
Well, I might point out very quickly right up front that in this water use assessment, we track the total amount of water withdrawn, meaning the water supplied. And it's divided into two different sources, groundwater sources and surface water sources. And then it's subdivided by the type of water use that the water is used for, so public supply, irrigation, and thermoelectric power use, and so on. So it provides a snapshot every 5 years, not only of the total water use across the nation and on a state-by-state basis, but also how that water is being used and how how those uses are changing through time, ultimately. So if we look at a plot here that shows the national water use through time from 1950 to 2010, you can see, looking here at the blue bars, that through 1950 through about 1980, water use goes up pretty continuously. And it follows along pretty well with this white line, which is the overall population of the nation. In about 1980, it changes a bit. So the water use stabilized, even went down a little bit, even though population continues to increase through that time. And in 2010, what we found was that the overall water use in the nation dropped fairly significantly. And in 2010, water use overall was pretty similar to what water use was around 1970. And this is in spite of the fact the population has continued to increase through that time.
And looking at for Arizona, the next graphic you brought in, the numbers seem to follow the national trend pretty well, and you can see population growth in there, but overall water usage is down. Am I reading this correctly?
Yeah, so in this second chart we have a couple of things plotted. One is that overall water use, that the height of these bars represents the total water use, both supplied by groundwater and by surface water. And again, you see the trend from 1950 to 1980 or so, it steadily increases. the proportion, the ratios between the different types of use change through time, and we can talk about that a little bit. But overall, it increases through about 1980, but then there's a fairly dramatic change in 1980. So it drops off right about that time, and even starts to decrease a bit through time, even though population in Arizona, as we know, has been increasing very significantly throughout that entire period.
Do we know what that change was in the 80s that nationally and certainly here in Arizona we see a pretty big drop all of a sudden in water usage?
Well, we haven't done any particular study or assessment that would attempt to determine the exact reasons for these changes, but we certainly know that there have been improvements in conservation. The municipalities have been working to improve and reduce leaks in the distribution systems, for example. We know for Arizona that in irrigation systems, farmers have been moving to more efficient watering systems like drip irrigation systems and sprinkler systems, and moving away from things like flood irrigation that are less efficient irrigation techniques. So there's a variety of things that have been going on that have made our water use more efficient and reduce our overall water use.
Let's talk about Arizona and where we get our water from. Everybody in Phoenix and Tucson knows about CAP, but the Central Arizona Project, but where do we get our water from, and has that changed over time where we've gotten our water?
Yeah, in this next chart, actually, you can see the distribution of the sources of water that have been our water sources in Arizona since 1950. And one of the things that's perhaps a little surprising to folks is the amount of the water that we get in our total supply that's actually surface water. And largely that comes from Colorado River water, of which we get about 2.8 million acre feet per year. But we also have supplies that come from the major rivers, the Verde, the Salt, the Gila, and to some degree the Little Colorado River as well. And if you look at the data we have here, you can see this overall trend of increasing water use up to about 1980. And I will mention that 1980 is the year that Arizona adopted the Groundwater Management Act, which dramatically changed how we track and how we manage water in Arizona. After 1980, the overall use drops, but you can also see that after 1980, the proportion of water that comes from surface water actually becomes larger than the proportion of water that comes from groundwater. And as of 2010, about 58% of the total water supply for Arizona was actually a surface water source, which is a new renewable water resource.
And that is, of course, as we wrap this up with about 30 seconds left, because that's the arrival of the Central Arizona Project, or the completion of it, correct, that we see that change?
And part of that, it's because of the arrival of Central Arizona Project. But obviously the Salt River Project in Phoenix area delivers a lot of the surface water, and there are other ways we get surface water.
All right, Jim, well, thanks for coming in and explaining some of this to us. We'll put all of these charts up on our website so folks can take a second look at them if they want to.
Thank you so much. Fantastic opportunity to share this information. I do appreciate it.
Water is a national issue. Senator Jeff Flake spent the last year holding meetings across Arizona and in Washington to learn more about water and educate others about the water shortages in the state. My colleague Vanessa Barchfield recently sat down with Senator Flake to talk about water.
Senator Flake, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
It seems that a reduced allotment for Arizona of Colorado River water is inevitable. What will that mean for the state?
Well, it will mostly affect the CAP. It may have some effect of people who get water directly from the Colorado and Yuma, but the CAP will mostly be affected. And so right now we've been taking excess CAP water and storing it underground. It'll be difficult to do that, so we'll see some changes coming up. But Arizona has planned very well for these kind of shortages, and so we're in much better shape than California, for example.
So you don't expect the average Arizona consumer to notice when that happens?
Not for a while. Certainly some of the ag users, there'll be some modifications, changes there. But for a while, at least, if the current projections hold, the average consumer won't see much of a difference.
How effective can any of our efforts at dealing with drought be if we don't address climate change?
Well, obviously, when you look at the models going forward, we're looking at long-term drought. And so it's got to be taken into account. And it is in the modeling that we're using to figure out how much moisture is going to come in the upper basin, the lower basin. So it makes a difference. It has to be taken into account.
You had a meeting recently with McCain, Ducey, and Kyle. What did you gentlemen discuss? I believe it was about water.
Right, it was. We want to make sure that Arizona is speaking with one voice all of the stakeholders here, the ag users, the municipalities, and other water users, because this long-term drought is going to cause states like California, who are in worse shape than we are, to come to Congress with legislation wanting certain changes, maybe changes in allocation, and we need to be together to have the most leverage as a state. And like I said, we've had the benefit of a lot of foresight from elected officials, for the past century, and it's really incumbent on us now to make sure that that kind of planning continues. So Governor Ducey agreed to take the lead in convening forums where we need to, and getting the right people from the Water Resources Board and others together to make sure that the planning continues.
How much can conservation and improved infrastructure help Arizona's water situation?
That's obviously a part of it, and Tucson has really led the way. We've been doing it for a while. In Yuma, too, the ag users, the untold story is the conservation and efficiency that has already been gained there. So there's a lot that has been done there, but that is still a part, and obviously conservation we're going to need to redouble our efforts there.
And you mentioned, of course, that Tucson has always been sort of better at conservation than Phoenix, for example. Why is that, and will Phoenix ever catch up?
Well, I mean, it's a different situation. There's not as much ag. There's not as much land that was formerly ag, and so it's a different kind of mix. But I think Phoenix is making some strides, and we're all going to have to do better in that regard.
And how effective can California's cuts be without addressing water use in agriculture and farming?
Well, they're going to have to address a lot of things. A lot of California's problems are obviously because of the long-term drought, but there are self-inflicted wounds there as well. They simply have not planned, and they're reaping the whirlwind now because of it. And so I think that they're going to have to look at just about everything: allocation, conservation, augmentation, the whole smorgasbord.
And looking at California again, do you think it's time that Arizona starts rethinking or reshaping its own agricultural industry?
I think Arizona has, and like I said, the untold story is the gains that we've been making in that area. We're a lot more efficient than we used to be, and so I think that those gains will continue, and U of A has been a leader in research in terms of arid agriculture, and so there's a lot still to do, but we're in a lot better place than most states are.
What's come out of your year-long conversation on water issues?
Started this, myself and Senator Heinrich from New Mexico. We both toured the northern Arizona forests here in Arizona and then went over to New Mexico. He has many of the same issues we do here to look at the watershed. We need to make sure that we have a healthy watershed. That's where about half of the water used by the major metropolitan areas in Arizona comes from. And a healthy forest delivers a lot more water, more high quality water to our reservoirs than a choked, unhealthy forest like we have today. So we need to make a lot more strides in that regard. So that was the first part of the discussion. Then we had folks from Water Resources Board come to Washington. I had them brief my colleagues on the challenges that are ahead and where we are. And so we've had good discussions, not just here in Arizona, but in Washington as well. And then we've had various forums around the state, ending today here in Tucson. So it's been a great year. I've learned a lot. I've had to follow Senator Kyle, who was really an expert on water, and he'd done a lot for a number of years, and so I needed to bone up, and this has really helped.
And do you think anything substantive will come out of this year-long conversation?
I do, and I think, frankly, the meeting with the governor and his commitment to move ahead and convene, whatever forums need to be convened, have whatever discussions need to be had to make sure that we speak with one voice. We're going to need it.
What's Arizona's most urgent water need that Washington can deal with? Is it funding?
I would think that it's with regard to our watershed in northern Arizona. We've got to make sure that the fire borrowing that the Forest Service is doing, which basically takes the budget that should be spent to manage the forest, make it more healthy, and instead is simply used to suppress fire. That's been going on for a number of years, and until we can right that ship and make sure that we wall off funding for managing the forest, then we're never going to treat as many acres as we need to make sure that we have a healthy watershed. So I think that's priority number one.
Agriculture is the largest water user in the state. It's also a major part of the economy. Here to talk about farming and water is Brian Wong with BKW Farms in Marana. Brian, thanks so much for coming in.
No problem.
Let's start with your farm. Third generation, tell me a little bit about the farm. What do you all grow?
Our main crops are cotton, and we also do a durum wheat in the winter time as the lower temperatures help it grow here in the Arizona region.
And you also have now started barley, I understand.
Yes, we've partnered with some local breweries here in Tucson to do a malting barley, and this is our first year doing it, and it's actually turning out quite well. We weren't too sure how it would grow in this hotter environment, but everything seemed to go right, and we'll be harvesting it in about a month.
Let's talk about water and your farm in particular. As I said, third generation farming in the Marana area here in southern Arizona. Has the part of farming that involves irrigation changed at all over the 3 generations?
We kind of are still using traditional floodland irrigation practices. The one thing that we've changed dramatically since my grandfather started is all of our croplands are laser leveled, meaning that the water will flow smoothly across the field and not pond up in certain areas or go too fast across the field and start eroding the ends of the field as well.
For our viewers who may not be in the agricultural business, what is floodland irrigation?
We basically have boundaries around the field, and we have a siphon tube coming from our ditch, and we just fill up either the furrows or the bed full of water until we sufficiently wet the ground. And it's just basically looks like a lake of water after everything's out there, but it does soak into the ground after a few days.
How often do you have to do it in a typical growing season for a crop? Is it a one-time deal or is it a multiple?
It is a multiple times during the crop season. Depending on rainfall, just because you don't want to be watering it and rain come as well where you actually blow out the ends of your field, we irrigate maybe once every 3 to 4 weeks.
You said there were some changes over time, the laser leveling and other efficiencies. What are some of those efficiencies that you all are employing now?
Laser leveling is the biggest efficiency. It almost reduced the water usage by half on our farm. Another kind of water efficient tool is growing a certain variety of crop that will use less water instead of the plant wanting to use all that water to grow into a full mature plant. We're using more varieties that are only designed for a one growing season. So in turn, those plants will use less water over that growing season.
I assume you all get your water from the Central Arizona Project?
Yes.
Do you have any concerns as you look forward to hopefully the 4th, 5th, 6th generation doing this at the farm, that the water just won't be there?
Yes, there is always that uncertainty into the future. We do rely entirely on the CAP water. We haven't used any groundwater since the mid-90s. In our own personal situation, we are very fortunate to partner with Tucson Water, in which they provide some of their water allocation from the CAP so that we can irrigate our crops. But we also do get water from ag pools, which is a looming kind of thing over our heads that it is the first cut to the CAP if there ever is a shortage declared.
You said you hadn't used groundwater since the 90s.
Yes.
Was that a choice you made, or was it a choice that nature made for you?
A little bit of both. We did know that we were pumping the groundwater and water levels were declining, but since the CAP came through, basically it cut our farm in half. So we're very fortunate to have very close proximity to the CAP. It just made a lot more sense to have a sustainable water supply instead of relying on something that wasn't going to be renewing itself as fast as we were pumping the water out of the ground.
When you talk to other farm owners, I assume water is always a topic, or is it something that it's just such a part of life, dealing with water and water shortages, you don't even talk about it?
Well, it is on everyone's mind about will they have water for the future, because without water you can't grow anything. But there's also that thing in the back of everyone's mind: should water be used for the agriculture, or should it be used for development elsewhere? So that's another way that the water will be taken away from the farm if people decide that it should be used elsewhere instead of actually growing something in the Marana area.
Instead of growing cotton, growing houses.
Yes.
All right, well, Brian, thanks so much for coming in and talking with us and helping to educate our viewers about agriculture and water usage.
My pleasure.
And now the buzz. Wednesday marked the 100th day in office for Governor Doug Ducey. And this week was the deadline for him to act on bills passed by the legislature. He dealt with 44 bills this week. The governor vetoed House Bill 2318. The proposal the federal government turn over federal land to the state was a favorite of conservative lawmakers angry at the Fed's oversight of millions of acres in Arizona. Then Governor Jan Brewer vetoed a similar proposal 3 years ago. Conservative lawmakers say they'll bring the bill back next year. The governor also vetoed a measure exempting crop dusters and charter plane operators from collecting the transaction tax. The bill also wiped away any back taxes owed by the companies. Ducey said he didn't like the retroactive nature of the proposal, but he did like the future tax exemption. He quickly followed his veto with an executive order telling the State Department of Revenue to stop collecting the transaction tax from crop dusters and charter plane operators. Some say the governor doesn't have that power. The issue could end up in court. Governor Ducey signed a bill blocking the state and municipalities from using any money to enforce the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. The new law keeps Arizona from creating its own health care marketplace. Arizona residents buying health insurance through the Affordable Care Act must use the federal marketplace. So far, more than 200,000 Arizonans have purchased health insurance through the Affordable Care Act. Ducey approved Senate Bill 1241 preventing municipalities from banning plastic grocery bags. Supporters say that protects business. Opponents say the decision on such a ban should be up to local governments, not the state. Most of the new laws go into effect later this summer. And that's our show for this week. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for tuning in.